Good morning and
Hi.
welcome to Trip the Beltway. Fantastic. Good morning, Doug. Nice to see you.
Yeah, I really liked your artwork there. I thought we were going to come on now and talk about UFOs.
Hey, we can do that. We can do that anytime. But I'm glad you like it. I had a feeling you might have a comment on the opening, but I'm glad you like it.
I keep hoping the aliens will finally come clean and tell us what the secret is to gravity driven power and magnetism and all this sort of thing. And then we can forget all about the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes, exactly. It's hoping and wishing for sure. But I'm so glad you're here and glad to see the audience. My name is Kelly Vlahos. I am the host of Trip the Beltway Fantastic. I'm also the editor in chief of Responsible Statecraft. I am here with Doug Macgregor and our producer in the background, as always, Christopher Leonard. Uh, I don't think I have to introduce you, but I will for folks who might be meeting you for the first time. Doug. Doug is a retired colonel in the United States Army, former government official, author, consultant, and political commentator. McGregor was a key combat leader during the first Gulf War. His 1997 book, Breaking the Phalanx, argued for radical reforms inside the United States Army. He has been fighting for that ever since, which has pretty much torpedoed his opportunities as a consummate military insider in Washington, but it has made him one of the most reliable critics of the institution and the people who populate it. He served for a spell at the end of the first Trump term as senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. He is now leading an organization called the National Conversation. He is my friend of long standing, a man of stalwart conviction who has been an arch critic of reckless United States wars for as long as I have known him, and that's for about 2 decades now, stemming from the first years of the Iraq War. So I'm very happy to welcome him back to the show, Doug McGregor. Thank you.
Happy to be here.
So, Doug, I think it's safe to say that you were nowhere near the Hilton Hotel ballroom on Saturday night, but I'd love to hear what your first thought was when you heard that there was yet another assassination attempt against the president, this time a gunman running through the magnetometer at the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
Well, like everybody else, I watched it on YouTube or television, whatever it was. And, it's very difficult to distinguish fact from fiction. The one thing that struck me was the lack, or no, maybe it's not lack, but the relaxed quality of the security. I mean, normally, if a president is going to speak at a hotel, you go to every conceivable room in the hotel, everything is thoroughly checked and secured. All the people in the hotel are thoroughly checked and judged clean or suspicious, whatever it is. In other words, all the things that you normally expect to happen don't seem to have happened. And then I saw a lot of shots fired, and there don't seem to have been very many target hits, which is a little disturbing. Maybe they all need to go to the pistol range. Anyway, I don't know if this was a conspiracy, but when you see so much that is obviously so wrong, it's easy to conclude, well, this has got to be a setup.
I mean, were you surprised that the entire line of succession for the United States government was in that room with that laxed
Yeah,
security that you're speaking of?
I think you're right, and a number of people have brought that up. Again, it perhaps that's a reflection of the president's outlook that we're not aware of. Perhaps he's relaxed, which is a little surprising because the president, whoever the president is always under some kind of threat. And I would think at this point, President Trump is facing more than most.
Yeah.
So again, it's I don't have any current contacts in the Secret Service like I guess Larry Johnson does. So I don't know why certain things were not done. But you would think, given the fact that RFK was killed in a hotel, and that other attempts have been made on previous occasions in hotels, both here and overseas, that you might want to do a much more thorough security check than what was done.
Yeah. I mean, considering Butler, I mean, just that aside, I remember as a young reporter back in Connecticut during the 90s, just to cover, President Clinton had visited a school in New Britain, Connecticut, where I was writing as a reporter for the New Britain Herald at the time. And it was like a week before they were vetting every single person that was going to be near that school. And so it would, I don't know, I would just assume that they were vetting everybody who was going to be in the hotel at that time, because I've heard many people go, oh, well, this guy, the assassin, the would-be assassin, was a guest at the hotel. Well, that shouldn't matter. I mean, you would think that they're vetting every single person staying at that hotel at that
Well,
moment.
he also checked in with weapons. And it's a sort of standard operating procedure. If the president is going to speak in a hotel or in some location where there are people staying, all the rooms would be inspected. Everybody would be informed they're coming around, they're
Yeah.
inspecting, and something would have been found, or he would have bolted. We don't know, but it didn't happen. So was it a setup? Again, I don't know.
I don't know either, but I guess, and I'm hoping there will be some investigation. But considering that we haven't really had a full investigation of what happened in Butler, even, I'm not holding my breath. Let's talk about the war. Let's talk about Iran, the lack of progress in the talks. I think we have something teed up. I think it is cut two.
Canceled the talks in Islamabad, Pakistan, keeping Special Envoys Kushner and Witkoff here in the United States. He said just 10 minutes later, the Iranians made a new offer on paper, and it was better.
If what they mean by opening the straits is, yes, the straits are opened as long as you coordinate with Iran, get our permission, or we'll blow you up, and you pay us, that's not opening the straits. Those are international waterways. They cannot normalize, nor can we tolerate them trying to normalize a system in which the Iranians decide who gets to use an international waterway and how much you have to pay them to use it.
Well, Secretary Rubio is obviously not familiar with the Dardanelles, the Bosporus, and ultimately Turkey is responsible for controlling the traffic that goes through those straits. By the way, they've done an excellent job. We've never had a problem. I don't know of anybody who's really complained, and I think that's probably the model for the future. But that's a model that I don't think anyone in Washington is interested in. I think Washington wants, at this stage, all or nothing. There's no willingness to make any concessions of any kind. And that was the problem in Islamabad when Vice President Vance went over. He essentially tabled Israeli demands and said, here they are. So this is what you have to meet. And, the Iranians, I think, were quite perplexed. I think they came with something like 70 people. Everyone had carried lots of material with them, maps, data that was designed to support the negotiation. But there was no negotiation. I don't see any willingness to quote unquote negotiate because any negotiation that occurs has to recognize the reality that strategically Iran is in an unassailable position. We should have thought of that to begin with, but there was no thinking. Normally in the military, you have something we call the purpose, method, end state framework, where you say, all right, what do you want us to do? And what's the purpose? The purpose is what? Well, I think we went through several different ones. Stimulate unrest, bomb in support of unrest, decapitate the regime, change the regime, and then finally it became cause the disintegration of Iran and its society. I mean, that's where we went. Now, the method from the very beginning was always largely the same. Air and missile attack, and we know from experience, air and missile attack alone has seldom, if ever, worked. And then finally, the question is end state. What do you want everything to look like when this is over? I'm sure we didn't want the end state we have right now. We wanted Iran's total capitulation. And that's why there were these stupid remarks about unconditional surrender. When you make dumb policy statements that have no chance of success, and LBJ did this on more than one occasion during the Vietnam War, you can't retreat from it. You have difficulty doing that. That's where President Trump is. Anything he does now will be interpreted in his mind as a demonstration of our weakness, our failure. There is a way out of this, but I don't think he's inclined to take it.
What is the way out of this?
I think the way out is very straightforward. He goes out, he holds an impromptu press conference and says, I've just spent several hours talking to my advisors, looking at the condition of the global economy. It has become abundantly clear that the global south in particular, but that doesn't exclude Europe because Europe is also in a similar condition, is desperately in need of all the things that come out of the Persian Gulf, not just oil and liquid natural gas and liquefied natural gas. We're also talking about sulfur, aluminum, helium, nitrogen, and ultimately fertilizer. And it's being made very clear to me that if this current conflict drags on much longer, that the world is going to suffer and could actually go into a global depression. I don't want that to happen. So I am suspending immediately, as of this moment, all further military operations directed at Iran over the question of the Persian Gulf. We will turn to intermediaries and we will find a different way forward to resolve our disputes with Iran. Now, that to me would be well received around the world. Americans can understand that if you tell them that. We have farmers that are going bankrupt left and right now because they have no fertilizer. We just cannot even begin to imagine the consequences of this. Wars always breed inflation. Inflation is rising. Prosperity in the United States is built on two things: cheap energy and cheap credit. Well, cheap energy is drying up and cheap credit is going away. And if you don't have those two things, you're staring at least at a deep recession, and overseas probably something much worse. So that would be the logical approach. However, there's a third party. And that party is Israel, its lobby, and its supporters, its agents here in the United States. They have a say. Because let's be frank, if it were not for them and the demands they made of President Trump in this country, we would not likely be at war with Iran.
I totally agree. And I want to get to Israel in a second. But the scenario that you lay out would require a lot of honesty from the president, some straight talk. We were supposed to have negotiations, or there were supposed to be some semblance, we were told, of talks over the weekend. The Iranians never committed to an actual sit down, but the president, all week said he was sending Witkoff, Kushner to Pakistan. And it wasn't until Saturday that the president said, you know what, I called these things off. I called these talks off. I didn't send, it would have been a waste of time to send our negotiators there because the Iranians don't really know what they want. Now, we don't know exactly what happened, but it sounds to me that there had been a lot of threatening over the week, and they're getting the sense that the Iranians weren't going to sit down until they were promised certain things, like lift the blockade. So it seems to me that the president is huffing and puffing and trying to blow the house down, and the Iranians aren't having it. And instead of taking the path that you have suggested, Doug, he's flailing about and continuing to threaten. I mean, he's got Scott Bessent out there, the Treasury Secretary, really obsessing about how the Iranians are about to cave. They only have 2 days of energy supply. We're going to crush them. We're going to crush anybody who even does business with them. They are trying to convince the American people that the Iranians are like 2 seconds to collapse. And as you said, most of us have our own eyes and ears open and we can see what's really happening.
Yeah, well, there's no evidence to support that. I suppose part of the problem is NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. That everything that happens around Donald Trump, in vicinity of Donald Trump, has to bear his stamp, and his stamp is essentially consistent with Roy Cohn's famous 3 rules that he imparted to Donald when he was a young man. So you deny, you attack, and then you twist whatever happens to look like a victory.
Yep.
That's no way to conduct national policy, certainly no way to conduct national foreign policy, and certainly no way to conduct armed military conflict. I think the morale in the fleet is really pretty bad. There are a lot of miserable sailors, and I don't blame them. They've been out there in many cases for 10 months or more. It doesn't make any sense. The other thing is this blockade came out of the blue, came out of nowhere. And no one thought about it very carefully. When we blockaded Cuba, we called it a quarantine, obviously, for legal reasons. But when we did it, we had 180 ships at sea surrounding Cuba and also reaching out into the North Atlantic. We had that 180 surface ships. We had of that group 8 carriers. I think half of them were submarine chasers. And then you had large numbers of submarines. In other words, we had a very large fleet. We were operating in our home waters. We had plenty of logistical sustainment that we could draw on. We could rotate in and out quickly. None of those things apply in the Indian Ocean. The other thing is that Iran is not an island. It has endless land borders. It also borders the Caspian. And it has allies within striking distance, whether that's China or Russia. And you increasingly have an explosive situation in the rest of the region. You have the Egyptians and obviously the Turks who are looking at all of this and seeing what's going on, and I think are moving closer and closer to the edge of intervention. But there doesn't seem to be any understanding of all of that. And as a result, we get these dumb pronouncements that just don't make any sense.
No. I mean, you mentioned the U.S. capabilities. Wall Street Journal had a story this week saying pretty much what we've known since the Houthi war, and you and I have talked about many times, that we have depleted our munition stockpiles to the point that we couldn't fight a near-peer adversary if we wanted to. Now, according to their reporting, the U.S. has fired more than 1,000 long-range Tomahawk missiles since the war with Iran began, as well as 1,500 to 2,000 critical air defense missiles. Earlier last week, CSIS reported that we had used at least half of our THAAD, Patriot, and Standard missile interceptors in the war. Last summer, Mike Friedenberg did a deep dive for responsible statecraft into our missile consumption and found that we likely burned through 33% of our Standard missile threes since 2023, when we started aiding Israel in its wars. Now, a lot has happened since last summer. We're not in very good shape, are we, Doug?
Well, I don't think we're in desperate shape, but it's not the best shape. And clearly, I think it would be a mistake to restart the war and effectively run through what remains in the arsenal. The reason for that is, and this is probably more important than anything else, we have no surge capacity. And I've got friends that have worked in the defense industry, many of them intimately familiar with the production of missiles of all types and kinds. And they've always said to me for years, I mean, this is back in the 90s when I was still on active duty, they kept saying, we have no surge capacity. If you run through the inventory quickly, it'll take us years to replace it. And I would always say, well, has this been brought up? And they said, oh, of course it's being brought up. I think you've got a problem in the defense industry. It's very eager to get its hands on all the money that is being promised right now with this grossly bloated defense bill. But at the same time, privately, they all know they can't surge production. So if we do run through another third of our arsenal so that we're up to 65 or 70% exhausted, then I think we're in very, very desperate shape. There's no question about that.
No, I don't know if you saw this, but The Atlantic, which I typically don't read, but The Atlantic published a very well-reported piece, had like 4 or 5 reporters on it yesterday, that quoted officials inside the Pentagon saying that Iran retains 2/3 of its air force, the bulk of its missile launching capability, and most of its small, fast boats, which they say can lay mines and harass traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. One person told The Atlantic, those are the real threat. It also reported in the same piece that none of this reality is getting to the president, that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth are whitewashing everything for Trump, that he only gets the Fox News version of the events in his bubble and acts accordingly. What do you think of the reporting about Iran's maintaining its capabilities? And B, you know the president and you're aware of how his inner circle operates. Could it be true that he's literally like not getting the true picture of what's going on and is reacting to this false narrative?
Well, let's take the first part you were talking about missiles, numbers of missiles. They started with roughly 25,000 missiles. My impression is that I'm being told by people who are more knowledgeable about this than I do and have access to information I don't, that they've got 18 to 20,000 left, and that they do have the capacity to produce missiles underground. And that's something I don't think we appreciate. The other point is that they started with roughly 50,000 or more unmanned systems. These are the various kinds of drones we've seen used, and they have perhaps of that number 35 to 40,000 left. So the Iranians are sitting on a very effective arsenal. We haven't been able to shut that down. I don't know that the comments in the Air Force are very important. Frankly, if you look at what the Iranians have achieved, they've demonstrated that you can defend yourself very adequately without an Air Force or a Navy. The small boats notwithstanding. But there's something else, and that is General Kane. He's the senior military advisor to the president. And if he doesn't tell the president the truth, we're in a lot of trouble. And I'm assuming that he does, because I have heard from people in Washington that are very close to the White House or in it, that everyone sort of lives in fear of an explosive temper from Donald Trump. In other words, Donald Trump is so frustrated and so angry that he has a tendency to shoot the messenger, especially when the messenger brings news that he doesn't like. Now, I said Dan Kane is just the senior military advisor. He has no command authority. So now let's turn to Bradley Cooper. He's the admiral who is the commander of Central Command. He's directly responsible, and he has access to the president. So if we're right and the real truth is not reaching the president, or the president is simply being told whatever the secretary wants him to hear, Bradley Cooper is the man that has to go to Washington and meet privately with the president. And the Secretary of Defense cannot stop that. It's written into law. You got to go read Title 10. Any combatant commander who demands to speak with the president can do that. Now, if the president says, no, I don't want to talk to you, well, that's a different matter. But my experience with him is that he would listen. He may not like it, but he's not going to turn somebody away. This was the problem with General McKenzie when he was the CENTCOM commander and presided over that disaster that we called withdrawal from Kabul. That was a catastrophe, and he was mightily responsible for that. And he should have been relieved and then ultimately punished in some way for his failure to organize that effectively. But that's where you really have to look. You have to look at Bradley Cooper. If what we're saying is true, and I think it is, then he's got to tell the president, Mr. President, this is where we stand. If you order us to go forward, these are the risks involved, and there's a very high probability that the next round of bombings and missile attacks will not produce anything different from what we saw before. But we have a lot of evidence that the Iranians will follow through on their threats. They have the precision-guided missiles and unmanned systems to utterly destroy the west coast of the Persian Gulf. And they have no incentive not to do that, because those places have been platforms for attack against them. And they have no love for any of the people that rule those places. There are 67 million people living from Iraq all the way down to Oman. They will not be able to stay there. Power goes away. There is no desalination. It doesn't matter. And the place returns to being what it was, decades ago before it developed into what it is today. It'll go back to being a desert. He needs to say that directly to the president. Because remember, I don't think that the president selected General Kane to tell him no.
Yeah.
After all, he came out of retirement. He was 4 stars. He must have known this was at least highly possible, if not probable. So I don't think he was the guy who was appointed to the job of chairman to tell the president no. Presidents usually get, not always, by the way, but usually get the generals they want. The last time we had a general that the president didn't want, interestingly enough, it was Marshall, because FDR disliked all of the Army generals whom he referred to as Republicans and anti-New Dealers, which was true. But it turned out that that was the best possible pick that he could have ever had, as we know. So,
What do we know about Bradley Cooper? Now, I remember covering his ascent to his current position as CENTCOM commander, and not really impressed. I mean, I saw some and I read some of the transcripts of hearings that he had testified in, and he just seemed to be like a creature of the system, very committed to this idea that there was this deep integration with Israel and the Gulf states, and Iran was their primary enemy, and that like, everything that they were doing was to either isolate and protect themselves against this Middle East scourge that is Iran. But I don't know too much about him, and I would love to hear your thoughts about the job that he's doing. And we tend to blame the military commanders when things go wrong, and I realize that they have civilian masters. But when did the civilian masters blame end, and it really is a commander issue in terms of like the success or not of a operation like this?
I don't think anyone who said anything else other than what you just recited would have been confirmed by the Senate. Remember, the Senate is essentially bought and paid for by the Israel lobby.
Yeah.
And they have a keen interest in sustaining the extraordinary levels of defense spending for all sorts of reasons that we don't need to go into right now. But the problem is that I don't think anybody who was very different from Admiral Cooper would have gotten there anyhow. So that's the first part. Look, his predecessor, General Carrillo, was identical, if not worse. So what are you looking for? Well, you're looking for the evidence that there is character. What are the three things that you look for in senior leadership? Character, competence, intelligence. Character implies integrity. Now, you put those three things together. Is he competent? I'm sure he was a competent surface warfare officer in the Navy. And in peacetime, that competence bar is hard to identify. I mean, you just don't know when a war comes how people will behave. You'd like to know, but it's not always predictable. Then he's intelligent. Obviously, he's intelligent. He's not a stupid man. We have a few, I take that back, a few dummies, but for the most part, the senior officers are not unintelligent. So now you're going to the issue of character. And how does he see himself? How does he see his role? If he is the commander of Central Command and all the air, land, and naval forces in it, and he's responsible for the execution of the mission, it's not enough for him to say, sir, if you want us to blockade the Persian Gulf, we can blockade it. He's got to be prepared to take a step forward and say, while we can do this, this may not ultimately achieve your desired objective. Now, I don't know what the president has communicated to these people. You want to destroy Iran? Well, that's done. Forget it. That's not going to happen. So what do you want to get out of the application of military power? Somebody needs to ask that to Donald Trump. This reminds me of an event where Bradley was asked by LBJ to go to Vietnam. And he came back and he reported to LBJ. He said, what do you think? He said, well, I can't find anybody in Vietnam from private up to general who really knows what the hell they're doing there. And he said, well, that's ridiculous. And so he picked up a legal pad, he handed it to LBJ with a pen and said, well, write down what the mission is so they know what you want. And LBJ sort of, well, it'll take me time to do this. And Bradley's answer to him privately was, well, then get out.
Right.
So I don't know that this has happened. And that's something that Admiral Cooper should have to raise. But I'm sure Admiral Cooper, like so many of these people in Washington, is afraid. He's afraid because what happens to him in retirement? His opportunity to become a multimillionaire may dry up. I mean, if you want to look at someone who is the model, I think the model is to some extent Jack Keane, and the other model is Petraeus. Petraeus works for KKR, which incidentally is in a lot of trouble in the private equity world, along with BlackRock. But having said that, these are people that have cashed in dramatically with the Israel lobby, with the financial system, in order to enrich themselves. How do you do that? Well, you don't do that by delivering a message to the president that these people don't want you to deliver. And who's in charge? You ask who's in charge, and you got to go back to J.D. Vance in Islamabad, who gets up and gets on the phone and calls somebody to get instructions. Who was that? The man that says, everybody reports to me every day.
That's right.
That's Mr. Netanyahu. So it's a bad picture. And what can you reasonably expect under those circumstances? I don't think very much.
Well, I have a couple questions, but one is a personal one. I mean, is this why you're not in the administration right now? Because you wouldn't be reliably a yes man, or couldn't operate in that kind of environment where you couldn't exercise integrity and character and truth, to a president who is in a bubble?
Well, let me back down from the hyperbolic language that you just used and say something
I've
else.
had a lot of coffee this morning, Doug.
Well, that's good. I'm still drinking here. It's the only thing I do drink. Uh, I think we need to understand that, first of all, I'm not Israel first. And when I sat and watched that unfold at the Republican National Convention in 2024, I got to tell you, I was in a state of shock. When the Israeli flag was on the wall and a big sign said Israel first, and some plump man came out and argued, Israel first. And everybody sat there not knowing what they were supposed to do. Then it became clear that as people were being vetted for key positions, that some of the vetting was being done by people like Larry Ellison. So if that's your vetting process and that's where you're headed, I had no chance under any circumstances of being nominated or appointed to anything. And that's not just Trump, that also applies to this organization called the Senate. So I think we have to keep that in mind. Beyond that, I did have a phone call from someone down in Florida in April of 2022 and said, well, Doug, what do you think about what's happening in Ukraine? And I said, sir, this is a catastrophe. This war needs to end as soon as possible. You should go out and tell everybody to stop this war. He said, why? I said, this is a disaster. He said, well, everybody here tells me that Ukraine is winning the war. I said, sir, Ukraine has no more chance of winning this war than Mexico would have of winning a war against us. Well, you have a different perspective. Click.
Yeah.
So,
You're
you know,
striked out. That's two strikes
right,
against you right there. Ukraine and Israel.
yeah.
You didn't have
So,
a chance.
no, and that's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. And I am just greatly relieved not to be part of the
Right.
sinking ship, because it's sinking now. And I think a lot of people will want to get off over the next few months. And I think we've already seen some evidence for that from Vice President Vance, who's allowed these leaks to come out suggesting that he does not have much confidence or faith in the assessments provided to the president by Hegseth and Kane. Well, usually when those kinds of things are leaked, it's not by accident.
I was going to ask you about that because that was a key driver, or a key theme rather, in the Atlantic story, that there was this distinct difference between Hegseth and Vance over the war. And I've seen a number of these stories now emerging there. Vance is really, and his people are really trying to distance themselves. I don't know if they'll be successful distancing themselves from this policy and this president. We got like a minute or two left. I was wondering, you've been obviously operating in this Washington world since you got out of the service. I've seen numerous administrations. You know how these cycles roll. What do you think the next 2 years of the Trump administration look like under these circumstances? We got these midterms coming up, but I mean, the first year, there was a lot of confidence. There was a lot of authority. He was throwing his weight around quite a bit. Now we have a war, like as you point out, is failing miserably. We have Friedrich Merz, of the Chancellor of Germany, basically saying that the president's been humiliated. You have never heard somebody in Europe saying that a year ago. What does it look like the next couple of years under this president?
Well, I'm not particularly high on Mr. Matz, but he's correct. I think we have to look at what's going to happen over the next week or two. If there is a decisive exit from this war, then I think President Trump and his administration will be wounded badly, but can still survive. Now, is he going to sort of clean up in the midterm elections? Well, very few presidents ever do that anyway.
Right.
Probably not. but I'm not sure that matters a great deal because we know there isn't much daylight between the Senate, the House, and Trump when it comes to matters of foreign policy that involve Israel. But I think he can survive. If he restarts this war, Kelly, I think he'll be gone by the end of the year. I think the cabinet will probably be told by the billionaires that funded Trump it's time for him to go. And they'll put in their latest candidate, which would be Mr. Vance. Because remember, Mr. Vance was a lot like Mr. Obama. Came out of nowhere, seemed to have been beautifully packaged, wins a seat in the Senate, and then shows up quickly as the vice president. And he's obviously beholden to lots of people with lots of money, probably some of the same people that President Trump is beholden to. It's all a function of what do the billionaires think? Is President Trump become more of a liability than an asset, in which case he's gone? I think that happens if he tries to widen the war, even though those same billionaires will encourage him to do that. They won't give up.
Exactly.
They will not give up because they are committed first and foremost to Israel.
That's very depressing.
Well, I'm sorry.
I don't even know what to say to that because that's the truth.
Future, and I try to cheer everybody up, but that's kind of the way I look at it. And if he stays in office, it's still going to be rough. It's not going to be walk. It's not going to, but he won't be removed.
Okay.
And if one remove Biden, good Lord, Biden was virtually non-compos menace for the last couple of years of his presidency, if not earlier. So I don't think Trump will be removed if he walks away from this stupid war, provided he says the right things.
Well, my producer Chris is signaling me because I think he really wants me to get to this, and I do too. Can you comment on this ridiculous visit of Kid Rock to the Pentagon briefing room? This is after he had a joyride, apparently, in a Apache helicopter with Hegseth. I know this is a big PR stunt, but talking about removing people, like Hegseth is not wrapping himself in glory these days. Do you think that he'll be the first to go?
That's hard to tell. That's very hard to tell. I can't imagine what Kid Rock was there for. I mean, turning the Department of Defense into a clown show is not a good idea.
No. In the middle of a war. On top of it, we're in a war.
Well, we say we are, but you and I both know that, yes, Iran is in a war. We are not. This is not an existential threat to us. And so who's at war? We don't have a universal service. We don't have a draft.
Yeah.
There are very few numbers of people, maybe 50, 60,000 people, maybe a little more in the region who are on the line, if you will, that are part of this. And this is another problem. President Trump did not say, look, I'm not doing this unless I go to Congress. I want to sit down and talk to the leadership of the Senate. He said, I don't need to talk to any of those people. I'll do whatever the hell I want. Well, that's the wrong move. So I think from the very beginning, every misstep is now beginning to catch up with him. But having said all of that, I have looked at some of the things that Hegseth has tried to do, and they were good. He's tried to roll back some very bad policies. But again, he seems to have a passion for performance.
Yeah.
And when you're the Secretary of Defense or you're the National Security Advisor, it's more important that you be more than you seem to be. I think that's really key. I had a long talk with Cap Weinberger, and I thought he was right. I thought Harold Brown did a good job. They were there, and they were solid. They were people that the president at the time could turn to and rely on for good advice. They didn't always do it, but that's the case. I don't think Secretary Hegseth understands that. I think he sees this job as eminently a newsworthy event.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking of Chuck Hagel. Not everybody liked him, not everyone's cup of tea, but he was a Vietnam veteran. He knew the seriousness of the position when he took it. It was after at the tail end of the Iraq War. I can't see him doing this kind of chest thumping, attention grabbing, holy rolling stumps that.
You're right, but there's something else that nobody understands this very well in Washington, because Washington is all about no change. Washington is about keeping the dollars flowing. But the truth is, we are at the end of an 80+ year process. The force structure we have, the force design, all of it is effectively antiquated and needs to be fundamentally reformed and reorganized. Nobody in Washington likes that because that, as I said, will interrupt the flow of dollars.
Right.
I think we're going to get this, but I don't think Secretary Hegseth remotely understands that. And that's not why he was picked. He was picked to do what he's doing for President Trump. And I think we need to understand that. President
Yeah.
Trump is getting from Mr. Hegseth what he wants.
Well, thank you, Doug. And thanks to the audience for sticking around. This was an incredible interview. I really appreciate it. And if you like this interview, please go to our home on YouTube and subscribe. We will only flourish when we have the support, and you can find us on other platforms too, including Spotify and Substack and Apple and Amazon. And thank you, Chris, for getting us on all of these platforms. Doug, I hope you'll come back and share your wisdom with us, because I'm sure there is more to come. Unfortunately, that you and I are not going to be too happy with, but always appreciate your insights.
Sure. Thank you, Kelly. Bye-bye.